let's look at Bangladesh. This is Bangladesh. Bangladesh is essentially at the delta of the Ganges River. Um, right at the sort of tip of the Bay of Bengal, and so, if you've ever been to the end of a river, they tend to spread out a little bit, and the Ganges River has the same thing going on, and so Bangladesh is a relatively low-lying area that is essentially, you know, mostly this sort of this river kind of going through right there. All right, Bangladesh has a lot of people as well. I should just say, just like India has a lot of people, so does Bangladesh. Now, I want you to look at this picture, and you can see the light blue there is what they're calling the normal flood area. Now, let's just be clear about this. If a flood sort of at this level happened in, let's say, San Diego, like there'd be, panic and running in the streets and things like that. This is the normal flood area, meaning we pretty much know that in a normal year, this stuff's going to be at least partly underwater. Even if it's underwater only a couple inches, it's going to be underwater. And we just know that's going to happen every year because of the rain coming out of the sky, the water coming down the Ganges, and the sort of the push from the ocean in. So that's just sort of normal understanding. We also know there's going to be flash flood areas. Now, when we have this as sort of our normal, what we'd expect is that not a lot of people live in those areas. And the truth is, there's just not a lot of room in Bangladesh if people don't live in those areas. So some of those, while I would definitely say, if you know this area is going to be flooded, 3 feet every year, you're not going to have a lot of people in the areas, but there's going to be towns, there's going to be villages, and then that's just the normal year. What happens when it's a really wet year? Well, this is going to be a lot more blue, and places that you thought were safe are going to be more underwater. But here's the thing. Really wet years are not, they're not quote unquote normal, but they're also not rare. And so that every once in a while it's just going to be a bad year. And that you just have to kind of be prepared for that. And if this is one of those years, like we're just going to deal with it by essentially, walking through water to go to the store or things like that, or building our house so that the things that can be water damaged will all be high. And we just know there's going to be, a layer of water in some places. So 2007, as you saw in that video, this thing called Cyclone Sidr came through. And again, we know what a cyclone is. It's just essentially a hurricane. And Cyclone Sidr came through at the end of a very wet season. So we have a couple things going on here. We had a very wet season, a really wet season where the monsoon systems converged. And then at the end of this season in November, as there was still sort of all this water that had dumped in India, so it's coming down the river, had dumped in Bangladesh, so it's already, the ground is saturated. Then you had this huge storm come through, which brought tons of rainwater, and it brought the storm surge in. And so what ends up happening is this whole area here gets flooded. All the red in there is flooded areas. And this is much, much deeper than essentially was planned for, I guess you could say, or was understood to be the case. You can see here sort of the idea of that storm surge coming in. Now, obviously, the storm surge comes in and then it goes back out. But in a lot of areas, it's going to leave water. It's going to leave standing water. If you have a well, right, and that gets to your fresh water, the salt water gets in there, you're done. No more clean water down there. And so whole areas here, and you can see we're not just talking about like just nobody's living here. There's lots of people in this area that are being affected by it. Plus all the way through, as you can see from this, if you sort of combine these two things together, the whole country is really affected by this. And you can see people, again, stranded. Like, where else are we going to go? Bangladesh, 2007, there's this major flooding of the Ganges. There's just a bunch of things that happen. It's not just the hurricane, the cyclone. It's a bunch of things that happen. So this year there's major flooding of the Ganges. And let's just talk about why. First of all, as we already talked about, there's strong monsoon rains. They're being dumped in India. They're being dumped in Bangladesh. And so there's way more water coming down the Ganges than usual. And of course, that's going to raise the level of the water. Another thing we have going on is the Himalaya glaciers are melting. And so more, because of climate change and global warming, all that kind of stuff, more water is coming out of the mountains because the glaciers are melting. But there's more. India has a real food problem. It needs to grow tons of food for the tons of people that it has. And we've talked about this. There's really nowhere else you can go to grow food. So instead of doing extensive agriculture, you have to do intensive agriculture, where you take the land you have and get as much out of it as you can. You're using up those nutrients and turning sort of good soil into more like dirt. And then what happens is when the rains come, particularly strong rains, it washes the dirt away into the water, and we call this soil erosion. We sometimes call it silt as it gets deposited, and that comes downstream into Bangladesh and gets deposited. So if I have this sort of deep channel, I know this is not how rivers work, but I have this deep channel and here's the river. As silt gets deposited, that raises the level of the river even if nothing else has raised it. So the more silt that gets deposited, the more it gets raised. And what you have in Bangladesh down at the end of the river is you have something much more along the lines of this, where here's the river. So if I'm starting depositing silt, the water goes up and starts spreading quite a bit more. So it has a huge, in fact, you see, they talk about this, new islands showing up, old islands being washed away. The map is constantly changing in Bangladesh. Not constantly, but it's changing more than you might think, just because of the deposit of silt and the changing path of the river. And then, of course, these monsoons converged over Bangladesh, and so they were just getting dumped on. So there's just saturation of water. And then in comes that Cyclone Sidr in November, and it just makes things that much worse. Now, you might say, okay, well, cyclone's over, they go home, they go home. I guess the water is gone. Everything's fine then. And the answer is, usually in these cases, the problem continues for a long time. The cameras are there to capture the cyclone because it's a really cool thing to watch the wind lashing around and the waves coming in and all that. When the cyclone's over, there's no more great photos, so the cameras go home. The problem stays, and it largely stays in terms of things like waterborne diseases. And there's a lot of ways we talk about waterborne diseases, but think about things like, what am I going to drink? Where's the fresh water going to come from now? So maybe we have to drink the water that's around us. That's not good water. Obviously, it's going to cause diarrhea and some other things like that, dysentery. We also know that where standing water is, there's going to be more bugs, and those bugs are going to carry diseases like, say, malaria or things like that. So waterborne diseases go way up at this point. And there's a bunch of other problems. I mean, essentially, you've washed away the ability to grow food. Whatever food you were growing that year is gone, but also the next year, if a lot of salt water is in that area, it's not a good place to grow food after that either. And so, what are you going to do for food this year? What are you going to do for food next year? It creates some really huge economic problems that are not just sort of that day. And then we would also say one more thing, and I'm just going to throw this out there and have you think about this, and we'll come back to this in a later class. But mostly the poor are affected. And I don't know this for sure. I don't have their information or anything like that, but I would make a bet that every single one of those people out there are very poor. And so the question is, how come the poor are affected? If rain falls and hits everybody, why is it that the poor are the ones that tend to suffer the brunt of these things? I want you to think about that. You're going to watch one more video where it's going to talk about what has Bangladesh tried to do to sort of fix this. But even that, the fix has raised more issues. So you're going to watch that, and then we'll be done. So that's it. Again, the point about this is that you think about sort of this. To understand the monsoon systems in Asia, it does a lot to explain a lot about Asian history, culture, economics, politics. Okay, I will talk to you guys on Monday. Have a great weekend.